Okay, thanks everyone. So we've clearly slipped our time a little bit. Hopefully everyone had a chance to meet one another a bit and chat in the break. So we started the morning with a couple of topics that are very, very new to a potential education system. And we're now probably going to be back on more traditional ground, but we're going to hear from two fairly untraditional sources. Now, you know, both the people you're going to hear from in the next hour are personal heroes of mine. Both of them have, in their own ways, contributed unbelievably to the creative economy, not just in the UK, but worldwide over the last 25 years. While I wasn't a gamer growing up, I know a lot of people were, I was a big movie fan, and to actually get to meet, never mind, you know, spend a few minutes talking to the man behind Birdie, Chariots of Fire, Midnight Express, Bugsy Malone, you know, was a big honor. But I actually think what makes David Puttnam or Lord Puttnam even more impressive than being the hand behind some of those movies is the fact that he's probably one of the most educated men you will ever meet. He is the proud holder, I believe, I don't want to get this wrong because I know it's a very big deal to him, of 44, count it, 44 honorary degrees. So please give this man all of the respect and attention he deserves. So, Lord Puttnam, please.
Thanks very, very much indeed. The point of that intro is I also had 3 O-levels. And I would have 45 honorary degrees, except that one university I went to when I had 3 honorary degrees. I had a very nice chat to the Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor, after which she said, well, no, we're rather inclined to give you an honorary degree. Would you be happy with that? I said, I'd be thrilled, because it would mean I've got more honorary degrees than O-levels. That was that gone. They were not impressed. I left school, and I think this is relevant, and certainly there's a huge similarity between myself and Ian, with this final interview, with the man who was a very nice man called Dr. Packer, who was the so-called careers master. Dr. Packer always walked around in a black academic robe until he was giving careers advice, at which point he put on a sports jacket. I don't know what that was supposed to indicate, but so he was a slightly different person. So he said to me, well, Puttnam, you've managed to convince the examining board that you're useless. He said, we always do that at school. What do you intend to do in the future? I said, well, not really sure, sir, actually. He said, well, one or two ideas. He said, I think you should go into a company like Unilever or one of those companies that sells packaged goods. I said, well, why, sir? He said, well, you go around the country, it's quite an interesting job, go around the country, fulfilling or getting orders, and, you know, you might be able to progress through the ranks. I said, not quite what I had in mind, sir, really. He said, well, why not? I said, I don't know, it sounds a bit more like a van driver. He said, don't be silly. You didn't have to come to a grammar school to become a van driver. So I said, well, it does sound like a van driver. He said, listen, son, frankly, it's the only way you'll ever own a car. That was the line I left school with. But shook hands, and that was it. Now, I've got to believe, thanks to Shaw's introduction, that I'm not entirely stupid. But I did leave school having been pretty well convinced that I was dumb. And I do not believe I'm remotely alone in that. And I think probably at least 30, maybe 40% of the people here today had not dissimilar experiences. And one of the reasons why 20 years ago I threw myself post-movies into the world of education wasn't revenge, although it may have been tinged with revenge. It was really to try and ensure that there was a voice within the academic debate who had loathed school. You see, most people involved in the world of education, quite rightly, have very good experiences at school. They succeeded at school, they went to university, they succeeded in university, they came out, they loved education, and they made it their careers. So there are very few dissident voices in the education debate, or certainly that's been true for many, many years, who actually can say it was a hopeless catastrophe for me. It never engaged me, and I don't really think it ever particularly tried to. And what I'd like to do this morning, if I may, I'm going to show a couple of clips and some slides to make one overwhelming point. And it does end up slightly grandiloquent, but to you all, I apologise, because that's the way it cut together, and I wasn't going to change it. It wasn't worth changing it just for this morning to take a bit out. This is really about, my theme is, where do good ideas come from? And you won't be that surprised to know that what I'm going to start with is Steve Johnson's excellent speech that he delivered here in this room, actually, which then became animated, just as these guys over here are doing, and has been seen by 1.5 million people. But surprisingly, when I looked, not that many people in the UK seem to have seen it, which I find quite extraordinary. Even more extraordinary is I've constantly asked teachers in schools, wherever I go, have you run the Steve Johnson 4-minute animation? No. Steve Johnson's book in your library? I've never had a yes yet. So obviously this notion of where do good ideas come from, which will be utterly self-evident when you watch this clip, I'm certain of that, hasn't yet penetrated the educational establishment. One other point I'd like to make before I show it. I teach a lot, and my teaching, for a number of reasons, takes me to Asia. I've taught in Beijing, in Tokyo, and throughout Southeast Asia, Singapore particularly. And what is extraordinary is I read, and I absolutely understand how extraordinarily well education is going in a place like Shanghai, extraordinarily well. But I have to tell you one thing. As a lecturer in Asia, here's a total failure. I cannot get my students to ask me questions. I cannot get them to engage in a discussion, let alone an argument, that I think would be stimulating and a real learning issue. So there is a big, big problem. When you read those stats about the extraordinary success of maths in Shanghai, lying behind it is some other problem, which is this lack of real engagement about how things might be or might become, as opposed to how they are, or pure exercises in logic. Anyway, let's start, if I may, to get this right, with Steve Johnson. I may have to hit it twice. I do.
For the past 5 years, I've been investigating this question of where good ideas come from. It's the kind of problem I think all of us are intrinsically interested in. We want to be more creative. We want to come up with better ideas. We want our organizations to be more innovative. I've looked at this problem from an environmental perspective. What are the spaces that have historically led to unusual rates of creativity and innovation? And what I've found in all of these systems, there are these recurring patterns that you see again and again that are crucial to creating environments that are unusually innovative. One pattern I call the slow hunch, that breakthrough ideas almost never come in a moment of great insight, in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Most important ideas take a long time to evolve, and they spend a long time dormant in the background. It isn't until the idea has had 2 or 3 years, sometimes 10 or 20 years to mature, that it suddenly becomes accessible to you and useful to you in a certain way. And this is partially because good ideas normally come from the collision between smaller hunches, so that they form something bigger than themselves. So you see a lot in the history of innovation, cases of someone who has half of an idea. There's a great story about the invention of the World Wide Web and Tim Berners-Lee. This is a project that Berners-Lee worked on for 10 years. But when he started, he didn't have a full vision for this new medium he was going to invent. He started working on one project as a side project to help him organize his own data. He scrapped that after a couple of years, and he started working on another thing. And only after about 10 years did the full vision of the World Wide Web come into being. That is, more often than not, how ideas happen. They need time to incubate, and they spend a lot of time in this partial hunch form. The other thing that's important when you think about ideas this way is that when ideas take form in this hunch state, they need to collide with other hunches. Oftentimes, the thing that turns a hunch into a real breakthrough is another hunch that's lurking in somebody else's mind. And you have to figure out a way to create systems that allow those hunches to come together and turn into something bigger than the sum of their parts. That's why For instance, the coffee house in the Age of the Enlightenment, or the Parisian salons of modernism, were such engines of creativity, because they created a space where ideas could mingle and swap and create new forms. When you look at the problem of innovation from this perspective, it sheds a lot of important light on the debate we've been having recently about what the internet is doing to our brains. Are we getting overwhelmed with an always connected, multitasking lifestyle? And is that going to lead to less sophisticated thoughts as we move away from the slower, deeper, contemplative state of reading, for instance? Obviously, I'm a big fan of reading, but I think it's important to remember that the great driver of scientific innovation and technological innovation has been the historic increase in connectivity and our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people, and to borrow other people's hunches and combine them with our hunches and turn them into something new. That really has, I think, been, more than anything else, the primary engine of creativity and innovation over the last 600 or 700 years. And so yes, it's true we're more distracted. But what has happened that is really miraculous and marvelous over the last 15 years is that we have so many new ways to connect and so many new ways to reach out and find other people who have that missing piece that will complete the idea we're working on, or to stumble serendipitously across some amazing new piece of information that we can use to build and improve our own ideas. That's the real lesson of where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind.
So, the connected mind, my intention in the next few minutes is to try and prove to you by one example, but there are others, and I've got a couple that Ian and I have enough time I can show, prove how that does have a result. I mentioned I was not a great scholar. Now, one of the interesting things when you get into these discussions, and the gentleman here was at a Radio 4 discussion I was at last week, is that you somehow find yourself having to restate your belief in literacy and numeracy. I mean, that is ludicrous. The fact that you've got to say, yes, literacy and numeracy are really, really, really important. The fact that this debate hasn't moved past having to restate that is, I found, quite extraordinary. Yes, they're very important. Now, to me, what literacy and numeracy meant as a kid was comics. I gobbled up, I loved comics, all sorts of comics. So from the age of about 6, I was reading 3, then I swapped some at school, 3, maybe 4, 5 a week. And so much so, it was quite interesting, that my mother often used to remind me that in order to call me away for a meal or anything, she actually had to come up and shake me, that I didn't hear, nothing. I'm going to talk about how stupid I am, but literally she had to come and shake me away from my focus and my concentration on comics. It started off with these very simple comic strip comics, Dandy, Beano, but quite quickly I graduated to these. Now these were, anyone remembers, these are story comics. They would be 1,200, 1,500 word stories with illustrated covers, obviously. Sport was very, very big, a real constant. And these created real heroes. I mean, Limpalong Leslie was this extraordinary footballer, one leg shorter than the other, was also a shepherd and was a phenomenon. Wilson was this man, they didn't actually know when he'd been born, but he was an extraordinary athlete. Roy the Rovers, obviously. So these were my heroes, and I lived in their world, and their world informed my world. Easier for me, didn't meet my dad till I was 5 years old because he was away in the war. So for me, my father's here on the left, he was a war photographer. For me, my dad was one of these heroes. So I had a direct sense of identity with what I was seeing in the comics, and I had no reason whatsoever to doubt the as it were, the validity of them. I hope I haven't jumped past one. I think I may have done. It should be a great shame. Let's have a look. Yeah, I have. Just a second, sorry. Oh, there's one missing. Well, let me say, my hero was a character called Alf Tupper. He was an athlete. Alf Tupper was a working class boy, orphan, brought up by his aunt, and he was a wonderful athlete, and he used to go and run at meets against what he described as very snobbish, privately educated boys. And he was an extraordinary character. Alf Tupper was someone I followed avidly, and I'll come back to him in a moment. So that's, if you like, you want to give it a year, 1952, 53, 54. I then went through a period in 1964, and I'm going to come back to this, of being passionate about athletics. I actually created my own Olympic Games out of Sabutio men. I was very passionate about athletics, and 1964 Olympics was very important to me for a reason that I'll show you in a moment. It's in a clip. This, interestingly, is the very first treatment that I received from Colin Welland in July 1978 of a script called Runners that became Chariots of Power. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's Alf. Sorry, he should have come in earlier. So 1952, Alf Tupper's my absolute hero, a remarkable guy in every way. 1964 Olympics at Tokyo, I got a new hero. This lady on the left here was a woman called Anne Packer, who won the 800 metres gold medal in the 64 Olympics. Fantastic backstory in that she was actually a 400 metre runner. She was a schoolmistress. She was given 2 weeks off from school to run in the Olympics, as long as she was back on the Monday. She ran the 400 metres, came second in a new personal best, but was beaten. Got a silver medal. Her fiancé was the English team captain, a man called Robbie Brightwell, who was also a fantastic runner. He got a silver medal in the 400 metres relay. And here we are, the last day of the Games, 800 metres for women, and she's been selected because, frankly, there's no one else. So she's running in the 800 metres for the UK. And again, I don't want to spoil my clip. We'll come on to her in a moment. In 1978, I read this book, Bill Henry's History of the Olympic Games. And in the book was this paragraph, literally this paragraph. So, to recap, Alf Tupper's my hero from the comics, Anne Packer's my heroine for 1964 Olympics, and I read this. I wrote off the Amateur Athletic Association, who sent me all they had was their record books from 1923, 24, 25, which they very kindly loaned me, and that's when I commissioned Colin, whose slide should have come in here, but didn't. Now, pull all those together, and here's something I just assembled. Please hold in mind those three influences, and here's a clip that I put together to try and establish the truth of my story. This is, incidentally, the Tokyo Olympics was brilliantly shot by a Japanese filmmaker called Kon Ichikawa, probably the best film that was ever made of any of the Olympics, and I've used a bit of his footage.
In 1964, I was 23 years old. I was pursuing a career in advertising and doing okay. I think I probably took more notice of that Tokyo Olympics because I was an almost precise contemporary of the people who were going for the medals. And so I identified with them very strongly. And probably because she was particularly pretty, I identified with Anne Packer. And the delight that I shared with her, I think she was pretty delighted, at her winning the 800 metres during that Tokyo Olympics was something I'll never forget. I think it was one of the great moments of my entire sport watching career.
I believe God made me for a purpose. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure.
by, and I think Steve Johnson meant, by the connected mind. There was no point at which those ideas were completely disparate. But there is a moment, and there's a moment in all of our lives, where 3 or 4 things allied and come into focus. And if you're smart enough and got a good enough memory to collect those thoughts and pull them together, and I've done it on Local Hero at Straw, The Killing Fields at Straw, you've got a story, and if you've got a story that you believe in, you've got a movie, and if you are very lucky, you end up on the stage collecting an Oscar. But so this is not fantasy, this is real. My point really is, I don't believe there is anything in present-day education that allows or encourages you to do that. I don't think there's a single lesson or moment which encourages that. And by way of example, I often at this point, I haven't today, run clips from Ferris Bueller. Help memory people remember. It's 25 years old, Ferris Bueller. Okay, it's a wonderful, wonderful film. How many schools run Ferris Bueller as an example of what goes wrong when you've got an extraordinarily bright kid, an imaginative, an inventive kid who just can't hack it within the school? Schools don't. But it ought to be an issue that schools themselves should raise. And it should be a question they themselves are asking. Where? Because I'll tell you what, Steve Jobs is Ferris Bueller. Bill Gates is Ferris Bueller. Ian Livingstone is Ferris Bueller. Many of you are Ferris Bueller. But that is not seen as a role model. It's seen as an aberration. I teach this. I teach the idea that creativity is a muscle, that there are certain preconditions. Focus, for example, me being immovable for my comics as a kid. Tenacity, absolutely important. Collaboration, which you've heard a great deal about already this morning. Imagination, hopefully, is a given, but certainly can be promoted and helped. Resilience, this is a very big one. Resilience. Why resilience? Because resilience is vital, because most good ideas get rejected at some point. I cannot tell you how many scripts of Chariots of Fire were returned to me. In fact, worse, I actually had a deal at Warner Brothers at the time, a very nice deal, and the head of production at Warner Brothers, who's no longer with us, so I can tell the story, was very, very nice, thrilled to bits, loved Midnight Express and loved Bugsy Malone, and said, David, do us one favour. He said, and he picked up a red-covered script off his desk. He said, no more crap like this, and dropped it in the bin. And that was Chariots of Fire. So resilience, to not accept someone else's judgment of your idea, or someone else's judgment of the power of your idea, is fundamental to actually to seeing it through. So I'm going to stop there, invite Ian up, and then I've got a couple of odds and ends which we can run later if we have time. But that's the point I wanted to make, that there's something wrong in the system that does not actively encourage ideas to be brought out, pulled together, and my biggest thing is the odd kid in the class is probably the most interesting person in the class. And we need an education system that recognises that. Thank you.
Come on, let's have it. I've got you beat. I've got 5 O levels, by the way, and my head teacher said after I got them, he was very annoyed that I actually got them because I didn't actually conform to his ideal student. He said, Livingstone, why don't you go and work in a garage or something? I didn't. So I'd like to talk about, following what David said about creativity, about why I think play is so important as a natural learning tool. When we arrive in this world, we learn naturally through play. We interact and we discover and we understand trial and error. And when we learn English, no one's given us a book of 50,000 words. We just start learning it, and we learn naturally through our own curiosity. And we don't stop playing, and we don't stop learning. When we engage with puzzles like Rubik's Cube, we learn a lot more about the world. And when we apply rules to puzzles, they become games. I started in the games industry not long after chess was invented in 643, and found it a really wonderful, wonderful industry that is mainly seen as a bad thing by media in general. I started a company called Games Workshop. The really handsome guy on this side, that's me, with 2 old school friends, and we wanted to try and do something different in games, trying to kind of break out the mold of games as they were back then. And we launched in Europe, even though it wasn't our game. It was a game called Dungeons & Dragons. Now, this looks fairly ordinary, as you can see from the simplistic art. And yet it opened up the whole world of your imagination, of communication, of role-playing, of creating these fantastical stories on the fly, all within the confines of rules. And I just realized how amazing role-playing was as a learning tool, as a creative tool. So much so that we started this company. We went over to the United States to meet the inventor, Gary Gygax, and the people in this particular slide was Fritz Lieber, the science fiction author, very revered, Gary Gygax, the inventor of D&D, Professor Barker, another games inventor, myself holding the boxes, Rob Kuntz, one of the D&D authors, and Steve Jackson, my business partner, looking a bit grumpy. The worrying thing about this slide is that the first 3 people in it are dead, and I'm kind of next in line, but it was also good because we also got to meet Miss Wisconsin 1976. I don't know what she's doing, but I'm here today and enjoying it. And we also went back to open our own shops because nobody wanted to stock Dungeons & Dragons. They couldn't get their heads around this role-playing game. And the investments community certainly couldn't. You go into the bank and say, well, we've got this great game, it's a role-playing game, you kill monsters, you fight treasure, and you go these fantastic journeys, and you're a hero and a wizard and all these things. And it looks like you like a dog watches television and kind of urges you out. And so Steve and I were obliged to live in a van for 3 months. And I think as a lesson in life for kids of today is that you've got to have determination, follow your heart, follow your passion, and it's not hardship, it's actually fun. You're enjoying what you're doing far more than you ever would do if you're working for something that you don't do, just being motivated by money, because whatever you buy with that money doesn't make up for the satisfaction you would have had if you were doing what your heart told you to do. Sadly, well, this Games Workshop was 1978. Still trying to meet somebody who was in the audience and in the queue back there. Of course, life moves on. If you go past it today, now you'll see it's a Bosnia-Herzegovina Community Advice Center. And from role-playing games, Steve and I wanted to take role-playing to a wider audience, and we came up with this concept in the 1980s called Fighting Fantasy. These were the very first interactive books where it suddenly empowered the reader to make the choices. It wasn't reading a passive narrative, it was a gamification of literature, in that the reader was the central hero of the books. And the books were broken up into 400 paragraphs, each one numbered, and at the end of each paragraph to make a choice, whether to turn left, turn right, find a key. If you found a key in one room, you'd be able to open a door in another part. And so this was incredibly empowering for kids of the day, and suddenly they learned to read. And we dominated the bestsellers charts, and I remember going on Saturday Superstore on television, and John Craven was talking about the charts and like number 1, 2, and 3, and he said to me, his only question said, but when are you going to write a proper book? Well, I said, well, look, children actually enjoy reading, and they might go on. If you started off with Dickens, you might turn them off for life. But this got kids learning and creating, and they created their own adventures as well. So this was how they look, interactive, and lots of very exciting imagery as well to stimulate kids' imagination. Of course, they were hated at the time. The establishment, the Evangelical Society Alliance wanted to ban them, saying they were poisoning children's minds, they could connect into the devil because they were interacting with demons and ghouls. A bored housewife, a housewife in deeper suburbia spoke to a local radio station, said that having read one of my books, her son levitated. So, of course, the kids thought for £1.25 we can fly, we'll have some of that. And there was a vicar who threatened to change himself to Penguin Books front railing because they said, this was demonizing children. I'd like to thank them all for their publicity. It was fantastic because Penguin Books didn't believe them either, and so we needed people like this to really advance our cause. History has not been very kind to games. They've always seen it as a sort of trivial experience, even as far back as 1859 with Scientific American saying that chess is a mere amusement of a very inferior character which robs the mind of valuable time that might be devoted to nobler requirements. And when it comes to video games, well, the media goes in a sort of apoplectic fit when describing games like Grand Theft Auto, which should be celebrated as a great British success story. A cultural, social, and economic impact have, generating $1 billion in 4 days of sales is extraordinary. There it is, the wonderful thing. Let's say good things about it. It's a parody. So today, everyone's playing games, of course, because it's not just about consoles. Everyone's playing on their mobile device and smartphones. And the amount of creativity and learning that goes on in games is never often talked about. So for a start off, games are social. You're joining together, having a bit of fun. You're creating an experience that's enjoyable. Games are cultural. BAFTA recognizes the art form as having a real cultural experience, as you see everyone on public transport enjoying games from Candy Crush Saga to Clash of Clans, etc. Games that can be motivational, whether it's rehabilitation or training. You can use games to teach mathematics for training pilots. And education, mathematics. If you put maths into context, Conrad Wolfram's great argument that all we teach is formulas. We have no idea how to apply those formulas. Why not let the children use computers and calculators to do the computational bit? The important thing for children is to how they become problem solvers and apply their maths in a way that's contextual and that they understand. It doesn't have to be all about numbers. So I would argue that games are good for you in many respects. It's a case of hands-on and minds-on. From problem solving, from a game as simple as Angry Birds to the creativity that's empowering for children. You see everywhere, building their levels, sharing them with their friends. It's not done for the graphics. This is 8-bit technology from long ago. But the magic that they can create through using a game like Minecraft is phenomenal. So this is not going to be death by PowerPoint, but just to summarize just a few things why I think game skills are life skills. The problem solving, the intuitive learning, the trial and error, not being afraid of failure, to be risk takers, and the community that now, because of online gaming, that is created by people playing together and not being afraid to take a risk. These are all life skills. These are entrepreneurial life skills as well. The fact that you're managing and simulating and creating these fantastic worlds. I think if you can just park prejudice for games, think about what's going on in cognitive sense, it's good. So getting on briefly to education, David talked about his own education, how it's not always the fault of the teachers. There's some fantastic teachers here who do inspire and bring out the individual, the diversity that exists rather than the conformity that exists. But a lot of it's still maintained in the sort of Victorian broadcast model. And the quadratic equations, who's done a quadratic equation since they left school? Why do we have them? Why do we need to know how to work out this formula, as I said earlier? Let's just say how we can apply that. I spoke recently about we should Google facts more than we do, and was lambasted by, I won't go into it now, but the point being is that it's how we process the information that's available. We don't have to clog up our own hard drives, our brains, with stuff which is often seen in schools as important, but not necessarily important, because it's how we process our information rather than just store it here, which for me is the important thing to turn our kids into problem solvers. So let's do all the fun stuff that they talk about outside of school, try and bring it into school and make the environment be a little bit more playful, and have teachers acting as facilitators working with the children rather than just talking at them and requiring them to sit still when they're never going to, because theirs is a connected world through their smartphones. They share everything. So let the teacher share with them together. Let them collaborate. Peer-to-peer learning has been proven to be, because they're talking at their level, on their terms, at their pace, to somebody they respect, their peers. And it increases their own learning by sometimes 30%. And let's celebrate difference in the same way this fantastic cartoon does. We are all different. We shouldn't be all be tested against the same measures. If the test for today in this is to climb the tree, of course the monkey's going to win. But if it was pulling down the tree, the elephant win. And that is largely what exams are all about. The people who get the A stars are not necessarily going to be the best or the most imaginative employees. Let's collaborate, and together we can do great things. And last thing, let's celebrate science and art as one thing. To get often in education, we separate the two. Everything in life is a collaboration. This building, the beauty of it It's the aesthetic, it's the art, but we also have to understand the maths so it doesn't fall down and kill us. And ICT, I know we talked about it a lot today. I've been very privileged to be part of spearheading the campaign to disapply ICT and replace it with the new computing curriculum. And if you want to know about more of our work and how UK, the Games Trade Association, supported the work with the Next Gen Skills campaign, please download our report from Next Gen, which, from Nesta, which on the 20 recommendations, the main one being to have computer science on the curriculum as an essential discipline. A lot of education is about training children for jobs that no longer exist. What we need to do is train kids for jobs that do not yet exist. We have to give them meta skills of problem solving, communication, let them collaborate, let them become natural risk takers, and not to be afraid of failure. And that way, I think we'll build a better world. Thank you. So I think now we're going to have a little chat, which is going to be fun. I'm going to here to learn from the great David Puttnam, and then we're going to throw it open to people who want to agree, disagree, question, pillar, we don't mind. So David, how we are revered around the world for our creativity, perhaps the envy of the world. We're good at so many things in the creative industries, and yet often we're not very good at retaining ownership of our intellectual property. We let it kind of filter away, whether trade it away for project finance. There was 80,000 Brits working in Hollywood, but often as a work for hire. How are we going to encourage people the government to support the creative industries, for investors to invest in the creative industries, and for teachers and parents to understand the creative industries is a unique thing that this country has, which is the envy of the world. How are we going to raise the profile and all that stuff?
Well, I thought obviously it has to be something that's done between schools and parents. One of the things I've tried several times in the House of Lords, and it's profoundly true, I asked them how many of their grandchildren, it tends to be grandchildren, would like to be in what we loosely term the creative industries. And you get 80%. 80%. I've got kids. I could almost have made a career out of the number of young people or grandparents, or the grandchildren of my colleagues, who I've taken to tea to listen to their ideas about their futures. It's what the young people want to do. So you start from that point of view. This is not reticence, we're not having to drag people into it, it's what they want to do. And I think that in turn, if Michael Gove was sitting here now, he'd probably say, well, that's half the trouble, because there can't possibly be all those jobs for all those people, therefore we've got to divert them into other, more meaningful avenues. Well, if you divert any young person down a road that they themselves will probably not enjoy during their lifetime, the only thing I can absolutely promise you is they'll be lousy at it. Similarly, if you can divert someone into an area of activity that they actually actively enjoy, they will probably be pretty good at it. I used to talk about the film industry, and it's absolutely true. I should have said the two things that I loved as a kid were comics and movies. But the truth is, during the 30 years I was a film producer, if someone had come along with an edict that did not allow me to earn my living making movies, I swear to you I'd have found a means of making films at the weekends. Now, I've also said many, many times, and I think it's true and pretty surprising, is I have never been to work, because I assume that going to work means waking up in the morning and thinking, oh shit, I've got that bloody place again. And I've never had that experience. I've had the experience of thinking, today could be tricky, or I'm not looking forward to that meeting, or I'm nervous about something. I've never been to work. I've got up and gone to do roughly what I like doing and tried to do it well. Now, I don't see that as a revolutionary statement. I think it's completely obvious that if you've got a nation of people who enjoy what they're doing, you're likely to have a fairly successful nation. But these barriers are very real. And, go back to the point I made, because it may sound flippant. Were I a teacher of 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, I would start my year with them by running Ferris Bueller. And I'd want to have a long discussion with them about their reactions to the film, what they thought of Ferris, what their takeaway was. And I think you'd have the most extraordinary discussion. And the other great thing is you'd have a discussion that I think would reverberate throughout the year you spent with them as a point of reference, constantly. When I was producing movies, especially after one or two of them had worked, I used to send a letter on every movie to the whole crew the night before we started shooting. And I used to try and make it a bit different. I've got them all on file somewhere. But basically I'd say this, and I think it's very interesting and applicable to our discussion. I'd say, tomorrow morning, you're going to start a new film. Whenever you, as a person who works in the film industry, no matter what you are, whether you're an electrician, doesn't matter what your job is, whenever you tell people you work in the film industry at a party or any kind of an event, the first question you get is, what films have you worked on? Automatic, immediately. Well, what films have you worked on? Tomorrow morning, the film you're going to make is going to be one of the 3 films you mention for the rest of your life when you ask that question. And it had the most profound impact, absolutely extraordinary, because within their own, as well, industrial framework, they knew the truth of that. They absolutely knew that they always get asked that question. They absolutely knew that they would hopefully trot out 2, 3, maybe 4 films. And the idea that tomorrow's film could be one of them raised the game for everybody in the most extraordinary way. These are the things that I don't think occur in classrooms. I am the world's greatest promoter of teachers. I think they're remarkable people. I actually think the future of this country, of Western Europe, in fact, probably the planet, it is entirely dependent on the ability of a brand new generation, probably of teachers, to be brilliant, to literally teach out of their socks. They're going to have to. One of the reasons they're going to have to is, precisely as Ian just touched on, is that they're going to be teaching something no teacher in human history has ever had to do. They're going to be teaching young people to live, work, and succeed in a world that we ourselves only dimly understand. That's some trick. They're not passing on a slew of received knowledge that can be easily picked up and used. They're going to be passing on all the things on Ian's list that those young people have to, as it were, get their heads around if they're going to deal with the unknowns, not quite the unknown unknowns, but the unknowns of the next 20, 30, 40 years. So, first of all, education is going to be more important. Secondly, the opportunities for education, thanks to both technology and training, have never been greater. And thirdly, the importance of ensuring that our young people have the same opportunities that, in theory, I had and wasted, but certainly the same opportunities that I had have never been more profound.
Ian, can I kind of direct a question at you? Because you very modestly, talked about the fact that there's going to be a change in the national curriculum from this September, and you've been, totally instrumental in making that a reality. We've got you guys have sort of clearly fused the arts and the sciences in a totally remarkable way, and you talked about arts and sciences and wonder. We've got Conrad here, who's going to talk about maths this afternoon. We've got Shimon Shochen from Israel, who's going to talk about maths, and probably 2 of the world's leading thinkers and practitioners on that topic. And you mentioned, numeracy is critical. We talked about coding this morning. Given that literally in 6 months' time, plus or minus, this country's got to get excited about coding. And although the BBC is going to show us, I think, after lunch, some of their thinking, because 2015 for the BBC is the year of code, just like I think 2016 is the year of Shakespeare, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a big theme, and if the BBC gets behind a big theme, they can really get everyone excited, and it's not just going to be the BBC getting everyone excited. Davinia from Mind Candy, is she a tech company or is she a games company? Daniel from Spotify, is he a tech company or is he a music company? Nick Robertson from ASOS, is he a fashion company, is he a tech company? And I think one of the challenges we have is about branding, and given that both of you guys are geniuses when it comes to communications, what would your advice be to the BBC and to the rest of us in how we excite teachers and kids, starting with you, Ian, because you've thought a lot about this, come September?
The penny has dropped that At the moment, ICT is about using technology but gives no insight how to create technology. So we've got to move the mindset from consumption to creativity, and how coding really empowers creativity, not just for games, not just for films, but for everything in life, whether it's designing a jet propulsion engine or fighting cybercrime. And we're becoming exponentially reliant on technology. So it's important that we have these digital making skills, so kids of the future can not just understand, but operate in a world which is totally different to the world that we lived in. So how are we going to do this? The thing is, we can't afford not to do this. We have to start somewhere. And if you want children to operate, they have to start. And you do it on their terms. So rather than adopt the old model of somebody who doesn't quite understand what they're talking about, trying to lecture people who know probably a lot more than they do know, just embrace and just park the old ways and sit alongside and have a hacking mentality of understanding the world in which they live. And the teachers can work alongside and learn alongside their children. And let's get this collaboration and teamwork working. Let's celebrate, don't inhibit learning by the limits of your own knowledge. You have to go beyond that and accept, it's beyond the classroom. It's not your own knowledge, it's beyond the classroom. The whole world is at your fingertips to understand and learn. So it's something we can help. My only hope, my only fear is that having done so much to try and help and advance the cause of computer science and coding in particular, is that we don't assess kids in the old ways of another examination. Question number 1, who invented the World Wide Web? For me, that's quiz night question. Show me your code and I can give you a job. And so we've got to have practical, bring more vocation. We were talking earlier about polytechnics, how we can, there's so much academic snobbery in this world. Let's just roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty and get kids making and doing stuff, not just in coding, but everything in life, and build a portfolio of work that can show to prospective employers, look, yes, I've got these GCSEs, but look what I can do. And you show them what you can do, you're going to get a job.
I think there's some people who want to either make some comments or ask some questions, and then, we got lunch coming up. I also wanted to say that, if you just go down the stairs, there are 4 or 5 groups of primary school kids at the moment who are making stuff. They're coding, they're making a computer, they're writing, they are going to be learning music downstairs. So I would encourage you on the way out to go and spend some time with the kids, because there are a lot of big brains in the room, but I think we've all agreed that the biggest, most interesting brains are probably just downstairs. So do that on your way out. But let's just take a couple of questions. I think you were first.
Hi.
Stand up and say who you are.
Sure. My name's Hannah Betteridge. I work at Latimer Upper School, so I'm a teacher in the classroom. And currently in classrooms full of iPads, we've just introduced to all of our year 10 and 11, that's GCSE children, and our current lower 6th doing their A-levels. And it hasn't been without its problems. And seeing your presentation, particularly Ian, has highlighted to me that gaming is something which I don't really understand how that's going to influence education, but it obviously is, and this is something that teachers need to get behind. We rolled out the iPads with the intention that children would learn how to regulate them themselves, and that they would become responsible for their machines, and they would learn how to use them responsibly, but that just wasn't the case in our experience. So we've ended up with our own kind of app store for the school, and children can't play Candy Crush Saga at break time anymore. So I'm wondering, as a teacher sitting here kind of nodding with my school saying, yes, they shouldn't be playing Candy Crush Saga because they don't sit around and talk to each other at break time anymore. However, you seem to suggest that they're missing vital life skills for the future by us stopping these games. And I just wonder where the balance is, how you see the future compared to, on a more encouraging note, we're sitting down and trying to draw up documents that are moving in this direction. I'm here because we have a working party on 21st century skills. So, how does the future...
Share that with the group.
I am, yeah, I'm feeding back. Sorry, I'm rambling now, but how do we move forward? How do the teachers move forward? You know, how does more of your inspiration come into the school so that we can understand, you know, that mindset?
Easy, easy, easy.
Hello, my name's Zoe Rose. I'm from Government Digital Services. First to Ian, my husband is an international lawyer. He works in interesting things like fighting pirates at sea and things like that. And he attributes basically his entire career to running role-playing campaigns when he was a young person. Because it's role-based, you've got to get the sequences right. The question I would like to put to either of you that want to answer it, I've heard a lot of skepticism about the role of information-based learning in schools. I'd like to know how radical you actually are. Do you think we should stop teaching memorized knowledge in schools?
Well, we'll go in reverse order because my memory's not great, so I might probably forget the first question. But from my own point, you've got to use rote where it's applicable. So anything that's everyday and common, like times tables and spelling, as it were, even though I don't think spelling is ultimately that important because you'll learn it over time. I mean, it's interesting that Michael Gove wants to bring testing of 4-year-olds. I can't get my head around that because it was great that he introduced computer science, but why test 4-year-olds? If one child says brought and the other one says brang, they're going to get castigated, yet the context in which they wrote brang might be far more interesting and entertaining and creative than the person who happens to know it was brought. So, but let's just part of that for the second. My memory is so great. What was the question again?
How radical are you on knowledge?
So yes, you've got
Google.
to. Yeah, I think you can. Why not outsource to Google some of your learning? You don't need to cram this hard drive up with stuff. Some people say it's so important to learn stuff, but not at the expense of knowledge and processing it. It's the application of those facts for me that the important thing. You have to have a basic entry level. I say, adding up, multiplication, etc., and learning to read and write, fundamental skills, of course. But beyond that, you know, is it the date that's important in the history or the relevance that happened around it? We can always find the date anytime. What about the context of whatever that event was?
Another question here, I think.
Sure. Thanks, David, Ian, for basically almost creating the reason for my company. So I work for Schoolbow, and effectively we're the largest educational game in the world at the moment. And to give you an insight, we actually had a child in the US, and we focus on literacy and numeracy, those kind of fundamental core skills. And he was year 2, and he was the fastest child on our system. And we've got over 400,000 users, and he was the quickest, and he was the most accurate. So we contacted his teacher, and we found out, you know, how's he getting on at class? And she said he's really disruptive. And we went, well, yeah, because he's year 2, and he's operating at year 6 curriculum. Yeah, so we have to also look at how we change in the educational world to make sure we get the fundamentals right, but then we allow those children to be facilitated, not dictated to.
Yes.
Nice. You had a question?
Very good.
Mike Butcher. I'm editor-at-large for TechCrunch.com. We cover startups and venture capital. Your points, Ms. Livingstone, were fantastic, but could you comment on, frankly, what appears to be a dissonance between your view that there should be a teaching of coding and entrepreneurship and creativity and collaboration and the current UK government education policy, which appears to be more geared towards the learning of facts and as we've seen in recent news in terms of testing and writing lines? Will children be having to write lines of code repeatedly rather than just lines?
It'd be great if we got to write lines of code. What a brilliant idea. I mean, the reason I get criticised because it's hard to evidence what I'm saying at the moment, and so. But I firmly believe from my own experiences. I mean, education. The importance about education is it should be diverse, not about conformity. So if it works for me and if it works for a lot of people, why not let them have it? Why do we always want everyone to do the same 11 GCSEs? You're good at 8 of them, you're crap at 3 of them, but you get punished for the 3 you're crap at, rather than saying you're really good at that, and the rest of the time, don't bother doing the 3 you're rubbish at, because you're never going to be doing that. Do some project work that's relevant to what makes you, and inspires you, and what's likely to be part of your life going forward. So I think you have to be a lot more flexible in education to allow, as Ken Robbins say, to people to find their element and flourish, rather than being castigated and punished for stuff they'll never ever be good at.
David, do you want to, as you said, since exiting stage left 20 years ago, you've spent an enormous amount of time, obviously you're still involved in the creative industries, but with education, I know more recently in Ireland, where you live, spent time with Coder Dojo and the coding movement there. So I'm just interested to know, given your profound background in the creative arts, sort of what's drawn you towards that coding movement, and why you've been supportive of it and what promise you see there.
It's tangible, it's affordable. I mean, certainly Coder Dojo is affordable, and the enthusiasm of young people and parents indeed to get engaged with it has really taught the Irish government a big lesson. And in an odd way, the changes taking place in Ireland, tomorrow morning I've got a meeting with the Department of Education in Ireland, the changes that are taking place have been bottom up. They've been forced to just sit up and take notice. I've written so many notes down here, so let me just try and clarify a couple of things. One is, I did leave school at 16. I realised at 18 I made probably quite serious error in that I wasn't really equipped to be educated. And I took myself back to school. I went to the, in fact in those days, Regent Street Polytechnic, and to the Charing Cross, the art school at Charing Cross. But I created my own curriculum. I created a 9-subject syllabus for myself. And it was as varied as psychology. I did a course in psychology, a course in economics, a course in copywriting, and I discovered that I was an absolute natural and voracious learner. I should have made that point right up front. I loved learning. I still do. I did a thing the other day for television. It's absolutely true. I learned more last year, age 70, I'll be 73 next month, last year, than any other year of my life. Why? Because I'm teaching. I'm teaching all around the world. I am absorbing, I'm a gannet now for knowledge. So first of all, I'm certainly not anti-education, not in no way, shape or form. I'm also not anti-teacher. I created the National Teaching Awards because I felt the teachers weren't being sufficiently celebrated and weren't being sufficiently understood. So that's a series of givens. But one important point, I've only got a moment, obviously. When I'm lecturing, I've got a slide that goes up behind me. It wasn't applicable today, but I was very, very fortunate in that I managed, God knows I tried hard enough, I managed to get a job, as Saul knows this, as an ad agency called Collett Dickinson Pierce in 1962, which was a tiny agency at the time, but was clearly doing much better work than anybody else. And I kind of talked my way in and got well, that was the point. I became a kind of a group head, and in my group, although you've not done yourself too many favours recently, in my group I had a copywriter named Charles Sarchi, a copywriter called Alan Parker, an art director named Ridley Scott. And we shared a room, a tenth of the size of this room, and there was a lot of competition. It was a tough group, but we, I think, helped each other a lot. But here's the point. When I talk about this, and I show their images, I say, what did we learn at CDP? And this is what it says on the slide. At CDP, we were actively encouraged to be fearless. And I put that slide up. At CDP, we're actively encouraged to be fearless. It is that whenever I go, the most tweeted single slide I ever have created is that one. And what that tells me is that people, especially young people, are desperately waiting to be allowed and encouraged to be fearless. Desperately. And yet I would argue, having me tell me I'm wrong, I mean, and bear in mind, Latimer's a very, very specific school. I think that the overriding sense I have still in schools is fear. Fear on the part of the staff, of Ofsted and all the other things of assessment, of changing things. Fear on the part of the pupils of not getting through their exams. It's a fearful environment, when in fact it needs to be a fearless environment, which is, as Ian has said much better than I, is there to find out how good young people can be at the things they love doing. That's what school's about. And how long is it going to take us to get to that point? Very last thing I'll say on this, it's terribly important. I would be infinitely more interested in an education system that instead of looking for 5 A to C's, was looking for 1 or 2 A stars and anything else you can get. And of course, I'm forced to say it again, of course that includes literacy and numeracy. But why not find what a kid does at an A-starred level and focus on that and have the kid leave school knowing they are really, really good and appreciated at what they're good at, exactly as Ian's saying, and not this crazy kind of thing that somehow, if you haven't got this breadth, you are a non-starter.
So, I mean, we've earlier this morning I said I would be the Swiss timekeeper, and these guys are literally, I think, you know, just sort of rock stars of you know, the various professions that they've graced, and that's why we've gone on 15 minutes longer than we should have, because I think, you know, to leave with David's challenge of removing fear is pretty amazing, because when you remember that slide we saw this morning about how kids start, 97% of kids love school in kindergarten, and it goes down to, I think, 35% by year 8, and it doesn't really get back up again. That sort of entropy of killing a joy. And it's not just fear. Fear is, there's one aspect of it, you talked about a love of learning, and, you know, if we can inspire people, I think, to be passionate about learning, that's a huge challenge. So on the way down to lunch, having thanked these guys again, and we've got more rock stars this afternoon on maths, on science, and finally on design, that will really inspire, I think, all of us to think about what all of these things can be in the 21st century. Please go down and be inspired by, you know, kids who are still 8, 9, and 10, and probably haven't had, hopefully, the joy knocked out of them. They're one floor below you, and you can see them looking at maths, science, coding, and literacy with some of the tools that may be available to them. So thanks again to these guys. Enjoy the kids, have some lunch, and after lunch the BBC will show us a little clue, I think, a taste of how they're going to think about celebrating coding next year. Okay, thanks. Same place lunch as coffee, by the way.